My husband walked into his family's annual corporate gala with his executive assistant on his arm, introducing her as his future wife to everyone. 30 minutes later, he was staring at acquisition papers, his face drained of all colour. The look in his eyes when he realised I now owned majority shares in his family's company was absolutely priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The grand ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel had always been the venue for the Morgan family's annual celebration. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a warm glow across tables adorned with elaborate floral arrangements, orchids and roses in the company colours of navy and gold. Family portraits and company milestones were displayed on easels throughout the space, chronicling 4 generations of Morgan's success in the financial services industry. I stood by the bar, champagne flute in hand, watching the entrance. My heart wasn't racing anymore. That phase had passed weeks ago when I discovered the truth. Now a strange calm had settled over me, the kind that comes when you've executed a plan so meticulously that the outcome is all but guaranteed. Victoria? Darling, you look stunning tonight. Eleanor Morgan approached, her designer gown rustling softly as she moved. My mother-in-law had always been the picture of understated elegance, her silver hair styled in a perfect chignon, her smile practiced and measured. Thank you, Eleanor. You've outdone yourself with the arrangements this year, I replied, kissing her cheek. The familiar scent of her signature perfume brought a momentary pang of sadness for what was about to unfold. Despite everything, I had genuinely cared for Richard's family. Eleanor studied my face, her eyes narrowing slightly. Are you feeling all right? You seem different tonight. I'm perfectly fine, I assured her with a smile that revealed nothing. Just looking forward to the evening's announcements. The annual gala wasn't merely a celebration. It was also when major company developments were shared with the extended family and key stakeholders. This year would feature announcements that no one, save for me and a select few confidants, could possibly anticipate. Eleanor nodded, seemingly satisfied with my response. Richard just texted. He's running a bit late, something about finalizing details for his presentation. She glanced at her watch. He should be here any minute, I'm sure. He will, I said, my voice steady despite knowing exactly why my husband was late and what details he was finalizing. As Eleanor moved away to greet other guests, I caught sight of my brother-in-law James watching me from across the room. Unlike the rest of the Morgan family, James had always seemed to see beyond the carefully cultivated image I presented. He approached now, 2 fresh champagne flutes in hand. You look like someone who could use another drink, he said, offering me one of the glasses. That obvious. I accepted the champagne, appreciating his perceptiveness. Only to someone who knows what to look for. James leaned against the bar beside me. Richard called me earlier. He sounded excited, said tonight would be transformative for the company. I took a slow sip, letting the bubbles rest on my tongue before swallowing. It certainly will be. James studied me for a moment, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. Victoria, is everything all right between you two? I couldn't help but notice you arrived separately tonight. And lately, whenever I mention Richard, you get this look. What look? I asked, maintaining my composure. Like you're calculating something complex in your head. He paused. Like you are right now. Before I could respond, a murmur spread through the crowd as the main doors opened. Richard entered, immaculate in his custom tuxedo, his confident smile illuminating his handsome features. But it wasn't his appearance that caused the ripple of surprise among the guests. It was the woman beside him, Sophia Chen, his executive assistant of 2 years, her arm linked with his in a gesture that went far beyond professional familiarity. Isn't that? James began, confusion evident in his voice. Yes, I confirmed. That's Sophia. The room's ambient noise diminished as Richard guided Sophia through the crowd, stopping to introduce her to key family members and business associates, not as his assistant, but with phrases I could read on his lips even from across the room. The woman who's changed my life, and excited for our future together. I watched Eleanor's composed expression falter momentarily as Richard approached her with Sophia. Even from a distance, the tension in that brief exchange was palpable. Richard's father, Jonathan Morgan, founder and current chairman of Morgan Financial, appeared at his wife's side, his face an unreadable mask, as he shook Sophia's hand. "Victoria?" James's voice cut through my observations. "What the hell is going on?" "You'll find out soon enough," I replied, placing my empty glass on the bar. "Your brother has prepared quite an announcement for tonight." The dinner portion of the evening proceeded with superficial normality. Courses were served, polite conversation maintained. I was seated at a table with several board members, rather than at the family table where Richard sat with Sophia at his side. If anyone found this arrangement unusual, they were too restrained to comment directly. Throughout the meal, I felt gazes shifting between Richard and me, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Had there been signs of trouble in our 7-year marriage that they had missed? Was this some sort of misunderstanding, a business arrangement they weren't privy to? As dessert was being served, Jonathan Morgan rose to begin the formal portion of the evening. After acknowledging company achievements and recognizing key contributors, he introduced Richard, who has some exciting developments to share about Morgan Financial's future direction. Richard approached the podium with the confidence of someone who believed they controlled the narrative. His charisma had always been his greatest asset, both professionally and personally. It was what had drawn me to him a decade ago when we met at a charity gala, his attention making me feel like the only person in a crowded room. "Thank you, Father," Richard began, surveying the room with practiced ease. "Morgan Financial stands at a pivotal moment in our history. The decisions we make now will define our legacy for generations to come." He continued with an overview of the company's strong financial position before shifting tone, becoming more personal. "Before I share our exciting strategic developments, I want to address something of a more private nature." My moment was approaching. I reached for the leather portfolio I had placed beneath my chair, confirming it was within easy grasp. "As some of you may have noticed," Richard continued, "I'm accompanied tonight by Sophia Chen, who many of you know as my executive assistant." He gestured towards her and she offered a nervous smile to the audience. "What you don't know is that Sophia has become much more than a colleague to me. She has become my partner, my confidant, and the woman with whom I plan to build a future." A hushed murmur rippled through the ballroom. Richard raised his hand slightly, requesting silence. "I know this comes as a surprise to many of you. Victoria and I have been discussing our situation privately for some time, and we've mutually agreed that our marriage has run its course. We've grown apart, developed different visions for our futures. While these transitions are never easy, we're committed to handling this change with the dignity and respect that the Morgan name demands." The audacity of his lie momentarily took my breath away. There had been no discussions, no mutual agreement. The only thing mutual in our relationship had been the bank accounts I had systematically emptied over the past month, transferring funds into offshore investments he couldn't trace or touch. "Looking to the future," Richard continued, seemingly untroubled by the shocked expressions surrounding him, "I'm excited to announce a restructuring of Morgan Financial's leadership. With my father stepping into an advisory role, I will assume the position of CEO, with a bold vision to expand our Asia-Pacific operations, a strategic direction that Sophia, with her international expertise, has been instrumental in developing. He was nearly finished laying out his version of reality. My pulse remained steady as I prepared for my response. So, while tonight marks a personal transition in my life, Richard concluded, it also heralds an exciting new chapter for Morgan Financial. I appreciate your understanding and continued support as we embrace these changes. He raised his glass to new beginnings. A scattered, uncertain response followed. A few glasses raised, uncomfortable glances exchanged. In the awkward silence that followed, I rose from my seat, portfolio in hand, and made my way to the podium. Richard's expression flickered with surprise, then annoyance, then a practiced smile as he prepared to manage what he likely assumed would be an emotional scene. "Victoria," he said softly as I approached, loud enough for only me to hear, "this isn't the appropriate time for discussion. We can talk privately later." I smiled in response, the same smile I had perfected over years of corporate negotiations before I had set it aside to support his career. "Oh, I think this is exactly the right time, Richard. You've shared your announcement. Now I'd like to share mine." Before he could object, I stepped to the microphone, facing the assembled guests, the Morgan family, board members, key investors, and corporate partners. All people who had known me primarily as Richard's wife, the supportive spouse who had gracefully stepped back from her own promising career in venture capital to help him climb the Morgan corporate ladder. Good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me well beyond my role as Richard's wife, allow me to reintroduce myself. I'm Victoria Reeves Morgan, former senior partner at Criterion Ventures, before I redirected my focus to supporting the Morgan family interests. I paused, making eye contact with several key board members, a decision that, in light of recent developments, I've had cause to reevaluate. Richard shifted beside me, his confidence visibly wavering for the first time that evening. He had always underestimated me, assumed that in giving up my career, I had surrendered my ambition, my strategic thinking, my understanding of corporate maneuvering. While Richard has been focused on developing new directions for Morgan Financial, and apparently a new personal life as well, I've been engaged in some strategic planning of my own. I opened my portfolio and removed a document, sliding it across the podium toward Richard. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief as he registered what he was seeing. "As of 4:30 this afternoon," I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom, "I have acquired controlling interest in Morgan Financial through a series of strategic stock purchases from private shareholders and family members seeking liquidity." Gasps and murmurs erupted throughout the room. I continued undeterred. "The documentation before you, Richard, which your family's lawyers have already verified, confirms my 53% ownership stake in the company. While you were planning tonight's announcement of your ascension to CEO, I was finalizing the details that make that position mine to fill." I turned back to the stunned audience. "Effective immediately, I will be assuming the role of Chief Executive Officer of Morgan Financial with a restructured board that will be announced next week." The colour drained from Richard's face as he stared at the acquisition documents, frantically flipping pages as if searching for some loophole, some mistake that would invalidate what was happening. There was none. I had executed each step with meticulous precision, guided by the best financial and legal minds money could buy, professionals who owed no loyalty to the Morgan family. "This transition may come as a surprise," I acknowledged to the room, "but I assure you it has been carefully orchestrated to ensure the company's continued success and growth. Morgan Financial's fundamentals remain strong, and with new leadership, we have an opportunity to expand in directions that honor its legacy while embracing innovation." I turned to face Richard directly, lowering my voice slightly, though the microphone still captured every word. You announced the end of our marriage tonight without the courtesy of prior discussion. Consider this my response, not as your wife, but as your new boss." The silence that followed was absolute. The collective shock in the room was almost palpable. Richard's carefully constructed narrative had collapsed in spectacular fashion, leaving him standing beside me, document in hand, utterly blindsided by a woman he had gravely underestimated. In that moment, as I surveyed the room, from Eleanor's wide-eyed disbelief to Jonathan's calculating gaze to James's barely suppressed smile, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The pure electric thrill of reclaiming my power, not just professionally, but personally. I had entered this room as the woman Richard was discarding. I would leave it as the woman who controlled his family's century-old legacy. "Now then," I said, turning back to the stunned audience with renewed purpose, "shall we discuss the future of Morgan Financial?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The first 72 hours after a corporate takeover follow predictable patterns: shock, resistance, then strategic recalibration. The human dynamics, however, are far messier, especially when family relationships and betrayed marriages complicate the professional landscape. I navigated these turbulent waters with the same calculated precision that had guided my acquisition of Morgan Financial. As the gala disintegrated into stunned conversations and urgent phone calls, Richard finally found his voice. "This is impossible," he hissed, gripping my arm as I attempted to step away from the podium. "How could you possibly secure enough shares? My father would never sell." "Your father didn't," I replied gently but firmly, removing his hand. "But your cousins Michael and Sarah were quite eager to liquidate their inherited stakes for the right price, as were your Uncle William's children after his passing last year. You've been so focused on the central branch of the Morgan family that you overlooked the disgruntled relatives on the periphery." The dawning comprehension in his eyes confirmed what I'd always suspected. Richard's arrogance had created blind spots that made my maneuver possible. While he'd been cultivating relationships with board members and industry partners, I'd been connecting with the overlooked family shareholders who held significant portions of the company but lacked any real influence in its direction. Jonathan Morgan approached us, his composed exterior barely containing his evident fury. "Victoria, I believe we need to discuss this privately now." He gestured toward his office down the hall from the ballroom, the space where smaller, more sensitive business discussions occurred during these events. "Of course, Jonathan. I'd be happy to review the details with you." I turned to the still stunned audience. "Please, everyone, enjoy the remainder of the evening. I'll be making a formal announcement about our exciting new direction next week." As I followed Jonathan toward his office, I caught sight of Sophia standing awkwardly near the family table, her triumph of moments ago transformed into uncertainty. James approached her, offering what appeared to be a sympathetic escape. Despite everything, I couldn't help feeling a flicker of empathy. She too had been a pawn in Richard's game, albeit a willing one. Jonathan's office was a shrine to Morgan's success: awards, photographs with political figures, the original document establishing the company in 1923. Richard followed us in, closing the door with unnecessary force. "Explain yourself," Jonathan demanded as soon as we were private, all pretense of civility abandoned. I took a seat without waiting for an invitation, opening my portfolio once more. "The situation is quite straightforward, Jonathan. Over the past 4 months, I've systematically acquired shares from family members who are eager to convert their equity into cash. Combined with the shares Richard gifted me on our 5th anniversary, presumably assuming I would never exercise voting rights independently, I've secured a controlling interest." "This is corporate theft," Richard interjected, pacing the room. You've manipulated my family while planning to end our marriage." The accusation was so rife with hypocrisy that I couldn't suppress a laugh. "Planning to end our marriage, Richard? I found the prenuptial agreement you had drawn up for Sophia 3 weeks ago. The lease agreement for the apartment you secured for her 6 months ago. The offshore account you've been funneling company funds into for over a year." I turned to Jonathan. "Funds I've already traced and restored to the corporate accounts, by the way." Jonathan's gaze shifted to his son, something new entering his expression. "You've been embezzling." "It's not embezzlement," Richard protested. "It was strategic compensation structuring for tax purposes." "Without board approval?" I asked innocently. "Without documentation directly into a Cayman account under a shell corporation matching Sophia's initials? The forensic accountants I hired found it within days." Jonathan sank into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. "Do you have evidence of this?" I removed another document from my portfolio, sliding it across the desk. Complete transaction records, account details, and the legal opinion confirming it constitutes embezzlement under state and federal statutes. The room fell silent as Jonathan reviewed the materials. Richard's confident facade had completely crumbled, replaced by a look I'd never seen before. He hadn't just lost his family company, he was potentially facing criminal charges. "Your position is clear," Jonathan finally said, looking up at me. "What do you want?" It was the question I'd been waiting for, the moment when negotiation could truly begin. "I want what I've always wanted, Jonathan, to build something meaningful. Morgan Financial has tremendous potential that's been limited by outdated thinking and excessive caution." "And Richard?" he asked, glancing at his son. "That depends entirely on him," I replied. "I have no interest in pursuing criminal charges if the funds are fully restored and he steps away from the company quietly." "You can't simply erase me," Richard interjected, desperation creeping into his voice. "The Morgan name became my name when we married." "Unless you'd prefer I revert to Victoria Reeves while running your family company," I finished for him. "I suspect that would make the press coverage even more interesting." The calculated brutality of my response wasn't born from vindictiveness, but from necessity. Richard respected nothing except power. Not vows, not loyalty, not basic honesty. It was the only language he fully understood. Over the next 2 hours, we negotiated terms that would become the framework for the coming transition. Richard would resign officially for personal reasons and receive a modest severance with no ongoing role. Jonathan would remain as chairman emeritus for 2 years to facilitate client relationships before fully retiring. I would assume the CEO position immediately. By the time we emerged from the office, the gala had largely dispersed, leaving only essential family members and a few lingering executives. Eleanor approached as Richard stormed past her toward the exit. "What have you done?" she demanded, years of practiced social grace abandoned in the face of her family's upheaval. "I've saved your family's company, Eleanor," I replied with genuine conviction. Richard was embezzling funds, making reckless decisions, and preparing to take Morgan Financial in directions that would have destroyed its foundation. You may not believe that now, but the evidence will become clear in the coming weeks. Eleanor stared at me, decades of being the Morgan family matriarch evident in her rigid posture. "You were part of this family." "No," I corrected gently. "I was adjacent to this family." There's a significant difference, one that became increasingly clear each time Richard's indiscretions were quietly managed. Each time my contributions were minimized. Each time I was expected to sacrifice my ambitions for the Morgan legacy without being truly part of it. Something shifted in Eleanor's expression, not acceptance, but perhaps the first glimmer of recognition. As the wife of a powerful man who had built his empire in an era When women were expected to support rather than lead, she understood more than she would ever acknowledge aloud. "You'll regret this," she said finally, though her tone lacked conviction. "I don't believe I will," I replied. "But I do regret that it came to this. Despite everything, I care about the company and the people who depend on it. My actions tonight weren't solely about Richard's betrayal. They were about protecting something worth preserving." As Eleanor walked away, James approached, offering a glass of whiskey. "You might need this," he said, his expression unreadable. "It's been quite an evening." I accepted the drink, taking a small sip of the expensive scotch. "Are you here to defend family honor as well?" James considered the question, swirling his own drink thoughtfully. "I'm trying to decide if you're the villain or the hero of this particular story." "Why choose?" I replied. "The most interesting characters are usually both." A smile briefly crossed his face. "You know, I always told Richard he underestimated you from the moment you joined those strategy discussions 3 years ago and immediately identified the flaws in our Asia expansion plan, the plan he's still trying to push through with Sophia's help." He shook his head. "He said you were just repeating what you'd heard from your venture capital days." The casual dismissal was so characteristic of Richard that it barely registered as an insult anymore. "And what do you think, James?" "I think Morgan Financial might finally have the leadership it deserves." He raised his glass slightly. "Though I admit, I'm curious where I stand in this new regime." "That depends," I said, studying him carefully. "The COO position will be open once I restructure the executive team. Your financial acumen would be valuable, but only if you can separate family loyalty from business decisions." James raised an eyebrow. "You're offering me a promotion after orchestrating this coup?" "I'm offering you a position based on merit and capability, not family connection. That's the fundamental change coming to Morgan Financial." I finished my drink, setting the glass on a nearby table. "Consider it. But understand this, the old ways of operating are over. If you want to be part of what comes next, it needs to be on those terms." As I gathered my things to leave, I caught sight of myself in the mirrored wall of the ballroom. I barely recognized the woman reflected there, not because she looked different externally, but because the fierce determination in her eyes had been absent for so long. Somewhere in the years of supporting Richard's career, managing the Morgan's social obligations, and gradually setting aside my own ambitions, I had lost connection with the driven woman who had once been a rising star in venture capital. Tonight, she had returned, not just reclaiming what had been taken, but positioning herself to create something entirely new from the foundation of the old. The valet brought my car around, and as I slid into the driver's seat, my phone buzzed with a text from my former mentor at Criterion Ventures. "Just heard rumors from the Morgan Gala. Call me when you can. If even half of what I'm hearing is true, we have a lot to discuss." News travelled fast in financial circles. By morning, the business press would be scrambling to piece together the dramatic reshuffling at one of the city's oldest financial institutions. The narrative would be shaped by whoever controlled it first. As I drove toward the downtown apartment I had quietly leased 2 weeks earlier, anticipating the need for distance from the home Richard and I had shared, I began mentally drafting the press release that would introduce the world to the new Morgan Financial and its unexpected CEO. This wasn't just about revenge for a betrayed wife, though that satisfaction couldn't be denied. It was about reclaiming my professional identity, about transforming a painful ending into a powerful beginning, about creating the opportunity I had been waiting for without fully recognizing it. Sometimes the most devastating personal blows create openings for our greatest professional triumphs. While Richard had been planning his exit from our marriage, I had been architecting my entrance onto a stage I had long been qualified to command. Tomorrow would bring challenges, resistant board members, nervous clients, family backlash. But tonight, driving through the city that housed the financial empire now under my control, I allowed myself to fully embrace a simple, powerful truth. The woman Richard had dismissed as a suitable corporate wife had just become his most formidable adversary. And unlike him, I had no intention of losing. The first light of dawn was breaking over the city skyline as I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new apartment, coffee in hand, watching the financial district come to life. Somewhere in that landscape of glass and steel was the Morgan Financial headquarters, 52 floors of prime real estate housing over 400 employees, all of whom would be arriving to work today to find their corporate reality fundamentally altered. My phone had been buzzing consistently since 5 a.m. when the first business news cycle began. The official press release announcing my appointment as CEO had gone out at midnight, strategically timed to give journalists just enough hours to craft their stories before morning deadlines. By now, Richard's abrupt personal leave of absence and my ascension to leadership was front-page news on every financial publication. Morgan Financial undergoes historic leadership change, read one headline. Victoria Reeves Morgan takes helm after husband's departure, announced another. My favourite from the most respected financial journal cut straight to the heart of the matter. Venture capital veteran reclaims career to lead Morgan Financial into new era. They had no idea about the personal betrayal behind the corporate manoeuvring that would undoubtedly leak in time, but the core narrative was already taking shape. This wasn't just a family power shuffle, but the strategic repositioning of a valuable institution under leadership, better qualified to guide its future. At precisely 7:30 a.m., my phone rang with the call I had been both expecting and preparing for. Lawrence Winters, chairman of the Morgan Financial Board of Directors, and Richard's most steadfast ally. Victoria, he began without preamble, I've scheduled an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. to address this situation. Your presence is requested. Good morning, Lawrence, I replied, maintaining the professional courtesy he had dispensed with. I was anticipating your call. However, as you'll find in the corporate bylaws, emergency board meetings require 24 hours notice, unless called by the CEO or a 2-3 majority of the board. A pause followed as Lawrence absorbed the implication. I had already thoroughly reviewed the governance documents and was prepared for this predictable attempt to outmaneuver me. This is highly irregular, he finally said, his tone hardening. The board needs to evaluate these developments and ensure proper corporate governance is maintained. I couldn't agree more about the importance of governance, I replied smoothly, which is why I've already scheduled a comprehensive board meeting for tomorrow at 10 a.m. You'll find the agenda in your inbox along with supporting documentation about our current position and proposed strategic direction. Another lengthy pause. Victoria, let me be direct. Many of us have serious concerns about this transition. Richard has been groomed for leadership for 15 years, and I've been observing his preparation from the closest possible vantage point. Lawrence, I'm intimately familiar with both his capabilities and his limitations. I kept my tone measured but firm. I understand your concerns. Tomorrow's meeting will address them comprehensively. Until then, I suggest reviewing the financial documentation I've provided, particularly sections regarding certain irregularities in fund allocation that my team has already identified and corrected. The implication was clear. I knew about Richard's financial improprieties, which the board had either overlooked or remained ignorant of. Either scenario placed them in a precarious position. We'll convene tomorrow as scheduled, Lawrence conceded, though his tone suggested the battle was far from over. After ending the call, I dressed with particular care, selecting a tailored navy suit that projected both authority and professionalism. Today would be my first appearance at Morgan Financial as its CEO rather than as Richard's wife. Every detail, from my attire to my demeanour to the precise timing of my arrival, would communicate my readiness for this role. The company's security team met me in the private underground parking garage, their usual stoic expressions betraying subtle surprise at escorting me rather than Richard. The private elevator whisked me to the executive floor, where Richard's now my executive assistant, Marcus Chen, waited. Not Sophia's brother, as many assumed, but the coincidence of surnames had likely contributed to Richard's initial interest in her. "Good morning, Ms. Reeves Morgan," Marcus greeted me, professional as always despite what must have been a confusing transition. "I've prepared the briefing materials for your 8:30 with the executive leadership team, and the communications department has drafted talking points for staff messaging." "Thank you, Marcus," I replied, genuinely appreciative of his composure. "And please continue to call me Victoria. One thing that won't change around here is my preference for direct communication." He nodded, falling into step beside me. As we move toward the executive suite, the team is assembled in the main conference room. All department heads are present, except for finance. Mr. Adler is calling in from London. "And what's the mood?" I asked, pausing before we reached the conference room doors. Marcus considered the question carefully. "Uncertain, curious, some apprehensions certainly, but also, I would say, anticipation. Many have questions about the direction forward." "Understandable," I acknowledged. "Change brings uncertainty, even when necessary." As I entered the conference room, 8 pairs of eyes turned toward me, the senior leadership team that had operated under Richard's direction for years. Some I knew well from social functions and the occasional strategy meeting Richard had permitted me to attend. Others I had deliberately cultivated relationships with, recognizing their potential value long before I had formulated my acquisition plan. "Good morning," I began, taking the seat at the head of the table that had been Richard's domain. "I appreciate you all assembling on such short notice. I recognize that today's transition comes as a surprise and that you all have questions about what it means for Morgan Financial and for your department specifically." Alexander Reynolds, Chief Investment Officer and the person with the longest tenure in the room, spoke first. "With respect, Victoria, surprise is an understatement. Many of us have dedicated our careers to this company under the understanding that its leadership would follow a specific succession plan." "I understand that, Alexander," I replied. "Plans change when circumstances demand it. The succession strategy you're referring to was predicated on leadership that prioritized this company's stability and growth. Recent decisions and actions necessitated intervention." I opened the folder Marcus had prepared, revealing financial summaries that highlighted specific irregularities. These reports detail concerning patterns that emerged over the past 18 months. Unauthorized fund transfers, investment decisions made without proper risk assessment, client accounts managed with decreasing transparency. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. These weren't just administrative concerns, they were potential regulatory violations that could threaten the company's reputation and standing. "Why bring this to us rather than the board?" asked Diana Mercer, Chief Marketing Officer. "The board will receive a comprehensive briefing tomorrow," I assured her. "But you are the operational heart of this company. Your departments implement the strategies and serve our clients directly. You deserve to understand the circumstances that necessitated this change and to hear directly from me about our path forward." Over the next hour, I outlined my vision for Morgan Financial, not as a radical departure from its established strengths, But as an evolution that honoured its foundation while adapting to changing market realities, I addressed specific concerns from each department head, acknowledged the challenges of transition, and made clear that performance and commitment would be the only metrics that mattered under my leadership, not personal relationships or historical allegiances. Your positions are secure based on your contributions, I emphasised. I have no interest in clearing house or installing a new team. What I do expect is adaptation to a more transparent, accountable approach to our operations. By the meeting's conclusion, the initial shock had given way to cautious engagement. These were experienced professionals who had navigated corporate transitions before, if never quite so dramatically. While complete buy-in would take time, I had successfully established the tone for my leadership: direct, informed, and focused on the company's long-term health rather than personal vendettas. As the team filed out, James Morgan, who had attended not as family but in his role as Chief Strategy Officer, lingered behind. "Impressive," he said once we were alone. "You've clearly been preparing for this moment for some time." "Not in the way you might think," I replied. "I've been observing and learning since the day I set aside my own career to support Richard's, not with the intention of taking over, but with an ingrained habit of analysing systems and identifying both strengths and vulnerabilities." "And when did that analysis become a takeover strategy?" he asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. I considered the question, remembering the exact moment my perspective had shifted from supportive wife to strategic opponent. 3 months ago, I found documentation of Richard's plan to force a board vote on acquiring a struggling Asian finance company, a company Sophia's family had significant undisclosed interests in. The acquisition made no strategic sense for Morgan Financial, but would have effectively bailed out her family while giving Richard a foothold in Asia he could control independently. James's expression darkened. "The Meridian Group acquisition proposal. He presented it to the strategy committee as a market expansion opportunity. It was self-dealing, James. Potentially illegal self-dealing that could have exposed the company to significant liability while depleting capital reserves during an economic downturn." "And that's when you decided to move against him?" "That's when I decided to protect Morgan Financial from Richard, from his increasingly reckless decisions, from the damage his personal and professional choices were inflicting on an institution that employs hundreds of people and manages billions in client assets." I gathered my materials, meeting his gaze directly. The fact that he was simultaneously planning to leave our marriage was secondary motivation, though I won't deny it provided a certain clarity about how to proceed. James nodded slowly, processing this perspective. "You know the board won't simply fall in line tomorrow. Lawrence has already been calling members individually, building opposition. I expect nothing less," I acknowledged, "which is why I've prepared comprehensive documentation of the financial irregularities, strategic missteps, and governance failures that occurred under Richard's leadership, issues the board either missed or chose to ignore. Their fiduciary duty will ultimately outweigh personal loyalty, especially when regulatory compliance is at stake." As I walked through the executive floor toward my new office, Richard's former domain with its commanding views of the city, employees watched with barely concealed curiosity. I made a point of greeting each person by name, having studied the organizational chart thoroughly in preparation for this day. Marcus followed with updated schedules and priority items requiring immediate attention. Despite the circumstances, there was something profoundly validating about this return to executive function. The rapid-fire decisions, the strategic considerations, the management of both operations and perceptions that had once been the foundation of my professional identity before I'd set it aside for Richard's advancement. "Your 10 a.m. is with the legal team regarding transition documentation," Marcus informed me as we entered the CEO's office. "After that, the communications director, needs to review the all-staff message. Your first client call is scheduled for 2 p.m. Harold Jenkins from Momentum Capital has requested a personal update. I nodded, setting my portfolio on the desk. That had been Richard's just yesterday. Thank you, Marcus. Please add one more item to this morning's agenda. I'd like the facilities team to remove all personal photographs and items from this office immediately. Have them packed and delivered to Richard's residence. Marcus nodded, making a note. Anything you'd like brought in to replace them? I glanced around the space that symbolized both the culmination of my strategic maneuver and the beginning of a challenging new chapter. Not yet. For now, I prefer to start with a clean slate. As Marcus departed, I allowed myself a moment alone in the quiet of the executive office. The view showcased the city where I had once been a rising star before redirecting my ambition to support Richard's. The irony wasn't lost on me that in attempting to discard me, he had inadvertently created the perfect circumstances for my professional resurrection. I opened my laptop to review the day's priorities, but my gaze fell on a small notification in the corner of the screen. An email from Diane Winters, my former partner at Criterion Ventures, with the subject line, "Welcome back to the game." A smile crossed my face as I clicked to open it, ready to reconnect with the professional network I had maintained quietly over the years. Relationships that would prove valuable as I shaped Morgan Financial's new direction. Richard had assumed that in stepping back from my career, I had surrendered my professional identity entirely. Like so many of his assumptions, this one would prove catastrophically wrong. The path ahead would be challenging, the resistance substantial, the scrutiny intense. But as I began responding to the first of many urgent matters awaiting the new CEO's attention, one thing was absolutely clear. Victoria Reeves Morgan had not only reclaimed her place at the executive table, she now sat at its head, prepared to transform crisis into opportunity and betrayal into triumph. The boardroom at Morgan Financial had witnessed decades of pivotal decisions that shaped the company's trajectory. Generations of Morgan men had occupied the chair at its head, directing strategies that built the institution from a modest investment firm into a financial powerhouse. Today, the polished mahogany table reflected the tense expressions of 12 board members as they processed the comprehensive presentation I had just delivered. The silence that followed my final slide was weighted with conflicting reactions. Shock at the extent of Richard's financial improprieties, calculation of personal implications, and reluctant recognition that the company's future now rested in unexpected hands. These allegations against Richard are, Lawrence Winters finally spoke, choosing his words with judicial precision, deeply troubling, if accurate. They're not allegations, Lawrence, I corrected firmly. They're documented transactions with supporting evidence provided by our own systems. The external audit I've commissioned will further verify these findings, but the pattern is irrefutable. Margaret Chen, one of only 2 women on the board and a respected financial regulator before joining Morgan's governance team, leaned forward. The Meridian Group acquisition proposal? You're suggesting Richard deliberately concealed material conflicts of interest? The documentation speaks for itself, I replied. Sophia Chen's family holds significant interests in Meridian's subsidiaries that would have been substantially revalued after acquisition. None of these connections were disclosed in Richard's proposal to the Strategy Committee. If the SEC were to investigate, Margaret began. Precisely, I interjected, which is why I've already instructed our legal team to prepare a voluntary disclosure. Transparency and immediate remediation are our best protections against regulatory consequences. The implications settled heavily around the table. These weren't merely internal governance matters, but potential regulatory violations that could threaten both the company and board members personally. Arthur Pembroke, our longest-serving director and a contemporary of Jonathan Morgan, cleared his throat. You've certainly presented compelling evidence of concerning patterns. What remains less clear is why you, specifically you, should be the one to address them. The question cut to the heart of the resistance I had anticipated. Not whether the company needed new leadership, but why that leadership should come from Richard's soon-to-be ex-wife rather than the established succession pipeline. A fair question, Arthur, I acknowledged. 3 years ago, before setting aside my career at Criterion Ventures to support Richard's advancement, I led successful restructurings of financial firms, including Lancaster Capital and Meridian Trust, companies similar in size and complexity to Morgan Financial. My strategies increased their valuations by 32% and 41% respectively within 18 months. I paused, letting the concrete metrics register. Beyond professional qualifications, I bring something equally valuable: an insider's understanding of this company's operations coupled with an outsider's perspective on its potential. I've observed Morgan Financial's strengths and vulnerabilities from a unique vantage point, uninhibited by the groupthink that often constrains long-standing leadership teams. Several board members exchanged glances, their expressions shifting subtly. What I had presented wasn't emotional appeal, but data-driven rationale, the language this room respected, above all others. Additionally, I continued, as the controlling shareholder, I have a vested interest in Morgan Financial's long-term success that transcends quarterly metrics. I am not looking to extract value or position for acquisition. I'm committed to building sustainable growth that honors the company's legacy while adapting to evolving market realities. Margaret Chen nodded almost imperceptibly, the first sign of potential alliance from the governance veteran whose opinion carried significant weight with other board members. You've outlined Richard's missteps comprehensively, she noted. What I am more interested in now is your vision for Morgan Financial's future. Assuming we accept your leadership, and that remains under discussion, what direction would you take this company? This was the opening I had prepared for, the pivot from Richard's failures to my strategic vision. I signaled to Marcus, who distributed bound presentation packages to each board member. Morgan Financial's foundation remains strong, I began, but its approach has grown increasingly outdated in a financial landscape transformed by technology and changing client expectations. While our competitors have innovated, we've relied on legacy relationships and traditional services that are gradually eroding in profitability. Over the next 30 minutes, I outlined a comprehensive vision for Morgan Financial's evolution, not a radical departure from its core strengths, but a strategic repositioning that would leverage its established reputation while expanding into emerging sectors. Targeted technology investments, strategic partnerships with fintech innovators, expanded ESG capabilities to meet growing client demand for responsible investment options, streamlined operations to improve margins without sacrificing quality. This transition won't happen overnight, I concluded, but the framework is clear. Morgan Financial can either evolve deliberately under thoughtful leadership, or it can continue its gradual decline while competitors capture the future of financial services. Lawrence Winters, still skeptical but noticeably less hostile than at the meeting's start, leaned back in his chair. These proposals require significant capital allocation and operational changes. The disruption will be substantially less costly than the regulatory penalties and market devaluation that would result from continuing Richard's approach. I finished for him. The quarterly impact is outlined on page 27, with projected recovery by Q3 of next year, followed by accelerated growth compared to our current trajectory. The discussion that followed was rigorous, technical, and exactly what I had prepared for. Questions about capital requirements, staffing implications, client retention strategies, and competitive positioning. I addressed each with specific data and clearly articulated rationale, demonstrating not just vision but practical implementation pathways. 3 hours later, the board emerged with a formal resolution. Victoria Reeves Morgan was confirmed as Chief Executive Officer of Morgan Financial, with a mandate to implement the strategic vision presented and regular reporting requirements to track progress against established metrics. It wasn't universal support. 3 directors had abstained, but it was sufficient endorsement to legitimize my position beyond the technical control established through share ownership. The path forward would still face resistance, but now I had both the authority and institutional backing to navigate it effectively. As the directors filed out, Margaret Chen lingered behind. "That was impressive navigation," she observed once we were alone. "You anticipated every objection before it was raised." "I've spent years observing how decisions are made in this building," I replied. "The dynamics may change, but the fundamental concerns remain consistent: profitability, risk management, competitive positioning, and personal implications for those making the decisions." Margaret smiled slightly. "All true, but there's another factor you handled particularly well, though it was never explicitly discussed. The gender dynamic. I acknowledged the unstated concern that emotional factors might influence my leadership given the personal circumstances of my succession. Precisely. You demonstrated remarkable discipline in keeping the focus entirely on business fundamentals rather than personal vindication." She gathered her materials, adding, "That discipline will serve you well in the months ahead. The scrutiny you'll face as a female CEO, particularly one who replaced her husband under these circumstances, will be intense and often unfair." "I'm well aware," I assured her. "But scrutiny creates opportunity when you exceed the lowered expectations it often represents." As Margaret departed, James entered from the adjoining conference room, where he had observed the proceedings. "Congratulations, CEO Morgan," he said, a hint of genuine admiration in his voice. "You've accomplished what 3 generations of non-Morgan executives failed to achieve, convincing the old guard that someone outside the family bloodline could effectively lead this company." "Technically, I still carry the Morgan name," I reminded him with a slight smile. "For now," he acknowledged, "though I imagine that might change given the circumstances." "One transition at a time, I replied. "Corporate restructuring before personal rebranding." We moved to my office where Marcus had prepared materials for the all-staff communications scheduled for the afternoon. Confirming my leadership to the board had been crucial, but translating that into organizational alignment would be equally challenging, perhaps more so given the personal loyalties and uncertainties swirling throughout the company. "The executive team is assembled in the main conference room," Marcus informed me as we entered. "They are expecting guidance on departmental transition plans following the board's decision." I nodded, reviewing the talking points for both the leadership team and the broader staff communication that would follow. "Any word from Richard?" "His attorney contacted legal about personal item retrieval from the office, but he hasn't attempted direct communication with anyone on the executive floor," Marcus reported. "Security confirms he hasn't entered the building, and Sophia submitted her resignation via email this morning. HR is processing her departure paperwork." The efficiency with which corporate machinery processed personal drama was almost comical. Relationships untangled, responsibilities reassigned, access revoked, all through standardized protocols that reduced human complexity to administrative procedure. "I'd like to speak with the executive team alone initially," I instructed Marcus. "Give me 20 minutes before bringing in the department heads for the broader communication planning. Orgs." In the conference room, the same leadership team that had assembled yesterday morning now awaited direction with a new understanding of the company's situation. Their expressions ranged from cautious optimism to guarded neutrality, a significant improvement from the skepticism that had greeted my initial appearance. The board has confirmed my appointment as CEO with a mandate to implement the strategic vision I shared with you yesterday. I began without preamble. This officially transitions us from crisis management to forward planning. I need each of you to develop department-specific implementation strategies aligned with the overall direction outlined in the materials Marcus is distributing now. Alexander Reynolds, still processing his mentor Richard's downfall, studied the documents with professional detachment. These growth projections are ambitious given current market conditions. They're achievable with the right structural changes and strategic focus, I countered. Your investment team has been consistently outperforming market benchmarks, even while hobbled by outdated risk parameters and technology limitations. Imagine what you could accomplish with the resources and flexibility outlined in Section 3. A spark of genuine interest flickered across Alexander's face as he turned to the referenced section. Similar reactions spread around the table as each executive discovered specific opportunities relevant to their domains, expansions they had advocated for, but Richard had rejected, modernizations they had proposed, but been denied resources to implement, strategic pivots they had recognized as necessary, but been unable to push through established resistance. I've reviewed the strategic recommendations each of you has submitted over the past 18 months, I explained. Many were dismissed not because they lacked merit, but because they threatened established power structures or required investments that would temporarily impact quarterly performance. That short-term thinking ends today. The energy in the room shifted perceptibly as these seasoned professionals began to recognize that the disruption of familiar leadership might actually create opportunities rather than simply challenges. This transition will test every aspect of our organization, I continued. We'll face skepticism from clients, scrutiny from regulators, and resistance from those comfortable with established patterns. Navigating these challenges will require not just your professional expertise, but your genuine commitment to this company's evolution. Diana Mercer, our marketing chief, who had initially been among the most skeptical, leaned forward. The messaging challenge is substantial. We need to reassure clients about continuity while simultaneously communicating meaningful change. Exactly, I agreed. We're not abandoning Morgan Financial's foundation. We're building upon it. Our heritage remains valuable, but it can't be our primary value proposition in a transformed market. For the next hour, we outlined departmental priorities and communication strategies, establishing clear expectations and immediate action items. By the time department heads joined for the broader organizational planning session, the executive team had aligned around a consistent narrative and approach, not through coercion, but through recognition of genuine opportunity in what had initially appeared as disruption. As the expanded meeting concluded and leaders dispersed to implement initial transition plans, James lingered once again. "You're building momentum quickly," he observed, "faster than I expected. Organizational change is about addressing fundamental human questions," I replied. "Can I trust this leader? Will this transition threaten what matters to me? Does this new direction offer something better than what came before?" Answer those questions effectively and resistance diminishes naturally. Is that what you learned in your venture capital days? The human psychology of corporate transition? That, and watching your brother systematically undermine potentially threatening talent while elevating those who reinforced his perspective. I gathered my materials, adding, "Sometimes negative examples teach the most valuable lessons about leadership." James nodded thoughtfully. "And what about family dynamics? The personal side of this transition? Richard may have lost his professional position, but he's still a Morgan. My parents are devastated by these developments, Not just the corporate implications, but the public humiliation of it all. The question touched on complexities I had been strategically postponing, the personal entanglements that couldn't be addressed through organizational charts or strategic plans. Family reconciliation isn't my priority at the moment, I acknowledged. Building a stable foundation for this company and its employees takes precedence over managing personal feelings. That said, I have no interest in unnecessary humiliation or punitive measures beyond what's required for proper corporate governance. Fair enough, James conceded, though I suspect the personal and professional will continue to intersect in ways neither of us can fully anticipate. As we parted ways, I returned to the CEO's office, now cleared of Richard's personal effects and awaiting my own imprint. The afternoon sun illuminated the city skyline beyond the windows, casting long shadows that emphasized both the achievements this view represented and the transient nature of any individual's claim to them. My phone vibrated with a text from Diane Winters. "Dinner tonight? Seems like you might have things to celebrate and process. The usual place, 8 p.m. The usual place was where we had often gathered during my venture capital days, when major deals closed or significant challenges emerged. A private room at Castellanos, where professional triumphs and setbacks were dissected with equal candor among trusted colleagues. I responded affirmatively, recognizing the value of perspective from someone who knew me before I became either Richard Morgan's wife or Morgan Financial's unexpected CEO. This transition wasn't just about reclaiming professional territory or responding to personal betrayal. It was about reconnecting with the core of who I had always been beneath the roles and relationships that had temporarily defined me. As I reviewed the all-staff message scheduled for distribution within the hour, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation of the past 48 hours. The woman who had entered the Morgan family gala as an accessory to her husband's career had emerged as the architect of her own professional resurrection and the company's potential revival. The message emphasized both continuity and necessary change, acknowledging the organization's strengths while clearly signaling that business as usual was no longer an option. It was direct without being harsh, visionary without being unrealistic, personal without being emotional. A communication that established both authority and purpose beyond the dramatic circumstances of transition. As Marcus entered to confirm the final distribution timing, I made one last addition to the message, a quote that had guided me through my earliest professional challenges but seemed even more relevant to this unexpected chapter. The most powerful steps towards success are those taken on ground you never planned to travel. The journey ahead would test every capability I had developed throughout my career, but it would do so on terrain I was uniquely positioned to navigate, the intersection of intimate institutional knowledge and fresh strategic perspective. Richard's betrayal had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for a transformation that would extend far beyond our failed marriage to reshape an institution in need of new vision. Sometimes the most devastating personal losses create openings for our greatest professional contributions. The woman Richard had dismissed as an appropriate corporate wife had become the leader his family's company desperately needed, not despite the circumstances of transition, but precisely because of them. Castano's private dining room offered a sanctuary from the scrutiny that had accompanied my every move since the dramatic events at the Morgan Gala. The restaurant's legendary discretion had made it a favorite among financial executives for decades. Deals negotiated, alliances formed, and occasionally careers eulogized over impeccable cuisine and vintage wines. Diane Winters was already seated when I arrived, her characteristic punctuality unchanged in the years since we had worked together. As the founder of Criterion Ventures and my former mentor, she had shaped not just my professional skills, but my fundamental understanding of how power operates in financial institutions. Now in her early 60s, her silver hair elegantly styled and her intelligence as formidable as ever, Diane remained one of the few people whose opinion I genuinely valued. "Victoria," she rose to embrace me, studying my face with the perceptiveness that had made her a feared negotiator. "You look exhausted but energized." The particular combination that comes from achieving something significant while knowing the hardest work still lies ahead, I smiled, accepting the glass of champagne a discreet server had poured. "An accurate assessment. As usual. I ordered the tasting menu. I figured you probably haven't eaten properly in days, and decisions about food would be one too many for your already taxed executive function. Well, thank you," I acknowledged, suddenly aware of the physical toll the past 48 hours had taken. "The last real meal I had was breakfast yesterday, and that was just coffee and a protein bar between strategy sessions." Diane raised her glass. "To the newly minted CEO of Morgan Financial, and to Richard Morgan's spectacular miscalculation in underestimating the woman he married." We clinked glasses, the familiar ritual carrying new significance in these transformed circumstances. "Now," she said as the first course arrived, "beyond the public narrative and corporate messaging, tell me what's really happening, not the CEO's assessment, but Victoria's." The invitation to speak freely, to set aside the careful calculations that had governed every interaction since the gala, released something I had been holding rigidly in check. For the next 20 minutes, I shared the unfiltered reality behind the composed exterior I had maintained. The shock of discovering Richard's betrayal, the fury that had crystallized into strategic action, the complexity of navigating an organization where personal and professional dimensions were hopelessly entangled. Diane listened without interruption, her expression betraying neither judgment nor surprise. When I finished, she nodded thoughtfully. "You've handled the initial phase brilliantly," she observed. "The board confirmation was particularly impressive. They had every personal incentive to resist your leadership, yet you converted enough of them to secure your position. But you know as well as I do that this is just the first battle in what will be a protracted campaign. The honeymoon period will be brief." I agreed. "Once the shock subsides, resistance will organize more effectively. Lawrence Winters is already connecting with investors to express concerns about the transition." "Expected and manageable," Diane replied. "What's your timeline for demonstrating initial results substantial enough to quiet the skeptics?" 90 days for organizational stabilization and preliminary strategy implementation, 6 months for meaningful operational improvements, 12 months for financial performance that definitively validates the new direction." She nodded approvingly. "Ambitious but realistic. And the personal dimensions? The Morgan family isn't known for gracefully accepting defeat." This was the aspect I had been least willing to examine closely. The complex emotional and familial consequences that extended beyond corporate governance. "Jonathan Morgan has maintained public silence, which suggests he's taking time to assess options rather than reflexively opposing me. Eleanor is predictably horrified, though her social connections are primarily with Morgan clients, which creates an interesting deterrent to open hostility. Richard himself appears to be strategically retreating rather than mounting immediate counter-offensives." "And you?" Diane asked, her gaze penetrating beyond professional analysis. "Not the CEO, not the strategist, but you, the woman whose husband publicly humiliated her while dismantling their marriage. How are you processing that reality amid everything else?" The question penetrated defenses I had constructed precisely to avoid such examination. How was I processing the personal betrayal that had catalyzed these professional developments? The truth was complicated and not entirely flattering. "I've compartmentalized it," I admitted, channeled the emotional response into strategic action. The professional challenges provide convenient justification to postpone processing the personal implications. A common and effective short-term approach, Diane acknowledged. But, eventually, those compartments break down. When they do, it's better to be prepared than blindsided. She was right. Of course, the emergency phase of corporate transition provided temporary shelter from emotional reckoning, but that protection wouldn't last indefinitely. At some point, the personal dimensions would demand attention beyond strategic calculation. What would you suggest? I asked, genuinely seeking guidance from someone who had navigated her own share of professional and personal crucibles. Integration rather than separation, she replied without hesitation. The narrative that you've reclaimed your professional identity in response to personal betrayal is powerful and largely accurate, but it becomes problematic if it positions your leadership as primarily reactive, a response to Richard's actions rather than an expression of your own vision and capabilities. This insight struck with particular force. I had been so focused on securing operational control that I hadn't fully considered how the circumstances of my ascension might frame perceptions of my leadership over the longer term. You're suggesting I need to shift the narrative from response to initiation? I observed. From reaction to Richard's betrayal to proactive vision for Morgan Financial? Exactly. The transition can be the catalyst, but it can't remain the defining context. Your leadership needs to establish its own foundation, independent of the circumstances that created the opportunity. As our conversation continued through subsequent courses, Diane offered perspectives that only someone with both distance from the situation and intimate knowledge of my capabilities could provide. She identified potential blind spots in my strategic planning, suggested approaches to building crucial alliances, and recommended specific methods for balancing the demands of organizational transformation with necessary personal resilience. The next 30 days are critical, she emphasized as dessert arrived. You need early wins that demonstrate value beyond merely correcting Richard's mistakes. Identify initiatives that establish your distinctive vision rather than simply repairing his damage. I nodded, already mentally cataloguing possibilities. Projects that had been conceptualized but never implemented, opportunities that had been identified but never pursued, innovations that had been considered but deemed too divergent from established patterns. What about you? I asked, shifting focus from my situation to hers. Criterion is thriving under your continued leadership. Any thoughts of your own transition? Diane smiled, recognizing the deflection but allowing it. As a matter of fact, yes. I've been developing a succession plan that would transition operational leadership to Emma Xiao while I move into a strategic advisory role. The timing wasn't certain, but recent developments might accelerate my timeline. Recent developments? I inquired, curious about the hint of something significant beneath her casual reference. Morgan Financial will need a reconstituted board with members who understand both traditional financial services and emerging market dynamics, she replied. Independent directors with the stature to balance family interests with institutional necessities. I might know someone who fits that profile. The implication was clear. Diane was positioning herself as a potential board member, bringing her considerable expertise and reputation to strengthen my governance structure. It was a strategic alliance that would benefit us both while bolstering Morgan Financial's credibility during transition. That's a fascinating possibility, I acknowledged, careful not to leap too quickly at an opportunity that required proper governance consideration despite its obvious advantages. The nominating committee would certainly find such experience valuable. Let's allow that possibility to develop organically, she suggested with characteristic subtlety. For now, focus on operational stabilization and early strategy implementation. The governance refinements will follow naturally as your leadership establishes its foundation. As we concluded our dinner and prepared to return to our respective domains, Diane offered a final observation that would stay with me through the challenges ahead. What happened at that gala wasn't the beginning of your story, Victoria. It wasn't even the most important chapter. It was simply the moment when circumstances finally aligned with capabilities you've possessed all along. Remember that distinction as you navigate what comes next. The following morning, I arrived at Morgan Financial headquarters with renewed clarity about both immediate priorities and longer-term positioning. The executive team assembled for our daily coordination meeting had begun to adapt to the new cadence of leadership, more collaborative than Richard's approach, but more decisive than the consensus-seeking that had often prolonged implementation of necessary changes. "We've completed preliminary client outreach," reported Diana Mercer, our marketing chief. 87% of our top-tier clients have received personal calls explaining the transition. The response has been cautiously positive, with only 3 expressing serious concerns about potential disruption to their portfolios. "Excellent," I acknowledged. "What about those 3? Long-standing personal relationships with Richard. 2 are college friends. 1 is his former brother-in-law from his first marriage. Alexander will join you for follow-up conversations with each," I decided, nodding to our chief investment officer. "They need reassurance from someone with deep institutional knowledge and technical expertise, not just relationship management." Alexander nodded his agreement, making notes on his tablet. "I've already pulled their portfolio histories and prepared comparative analyses showing how our proposed strategic direction would benefit their specific investment profiles." Said, this was the kind of proactive coordination that would enable successful transition. Professionals with complementary strengths aligning around shared objectives rather than competing for influence or defending territorial boundaries. "Operations has identified 3 immediate efficiency opportunities," reported Carlos Santiago, our newly promoted Chief Operating Officer. "Legacy systems in compliance reporting, redundant approval protocols in client onboarding, and outdated reconciliation processes in the trust department. Modernizing these alone could reduce operational costs by nearly 4% while improving client experience metrics." "Implement all 3, I authorized without hesitation. "These are exactly the kind of improvements that demonstrate tangible progress without disrupting core services. I want weekly updates on implementation and measurable outcomes we can share in the 30-day board update." As the meeting continued, department heads presented similar opportunities, initiatives that had been previously identified but never prioritized, improvements that had been proposed but never resourced, innovations that had been considered but deemed too divergent from established patterns. Collectively, they represented not just operational efficiencies, but a fundamental shift in organizational culture from risk-averse preservation to strategic evolution. After the team dispersed to their respective responsibilities, James remained to discuss a particularly sensitive dimension of our transition planning. "We need to address the Richard loyalists directly," he advised. "There's a core group of about 15 mid-level managers across departments who owe their positions directly to him. They're creating resistance pockets that could undermine implementation if not addressed proactively." "Identified and mapped," I confirmed, pulling up a detailed organizational chart on my tablet. "But I don't want blanket reassignments or removals that could be perceived as punitive purging. Each situation needs individual assessment." "Agreed," James nodded. "Some can be realigned with proper leadership and clear expectations. Others may require more significant intervention." We reviewed each case individually, developing tailored approaches that balanced organizational necessity with fair treatment. By the end of our discussion, we had created a comprehensive plan for addressing potential resistance without creating unnecessary disruption or fostering perceptions of vindictive personnel actions. "You're handling this more thoughtfully than many would in your position," James observed as we concluded. "It would be easy to justify sweeping changes given the circumstances." "Easy but counterproductive," I replied. "Cultural transformation requires both decisive action and careful discernment." Richard's leadership created specific weaknesses, but Morgan Financial's overall talent foundation remains strong. "I'm interested in strategic reconstruction, not scorched earth." As James departed and I prepared for my next meeting, Marcus appeared with an update that momentarily disrupted my professional focus. "Richard's attorney has requested a meeting to discuss settlement terms for your divorce," he informed me, his tone carefully neutral. "They're proposing next Tuesday at their offices." The reminder of personal complications underlying the corporate transition momentarily disoriented me. Diane had been right about the limitations of compartmentalization as a long-term strategy. The professional and personal dimensions would inevitably intersect, requiring integrated rather than separate navigation. "Contact our counsel and schedule it," I instructed after a moment's consideration. "But make it Thursday rather than Tuesday, and here rather than their offices." The small assertions of control weren't merely symbolic. They established the fundamental dynamic for negotiations to follow. Richard had initiated our marital dissolution on his terms, in his timing, with his narrative. The response would occur on my terms, in my timing, with priorities I determined. As the day progressed through subsequent meetings, client calls, and strategic planning sessions, I maintained the focused engagement required of effective leadership. But beneath that professional execution, a deeper integration was occurring, a recognition that the personal and professional dimensions of this transformation weren't separate challenges to be addressed in isolation, but interconnected aspects of a comprehensive reinvention. The woman who had entered the Morgan Gala as Richard's wife and exited as Morgan Financial's CEO wasn't occupying two distinct identities in conflict, but experiencing the alignment of capabilities and circumstances that had been mismatched for too long. The professional strategist who had been subordinated to supporting her husband's career was now directing her talents toward institutional renewal. The personal strength that had been channeled into maintaining a failing marriage was now invested in creating sustainable leadership. As evening approached and the executive floor gradually emptied, I remained at my desk, reviewing implementation timelines for our strategic initiatives. My focus was interrupted by an unexpected visitor, Jonathan Morgan himself, appearing in my doorway without announcement. "Victoria," he said, his tone impossible to interpret. "Do you have a moment?" I gestured to the chair across from my desk, curious about this unscheduled appearance from the man whose son I had replaced and whose family company I now controlled. Jonathan had been conspicuously absent from conversations since our initial confrontation at the gala, his silence interpreted variously as strategic retreat, health concerns, or behind-the-scenes maneuvering. "I've been reviewing the operational changes you've implemented in your first week," he began without preamble, "along with the strategic framework presented to the board." I waited, offering neither defense nor explanation. Whatever Jonathan's purpose in this unexpected visit, it would reveal itself more clearly without my intervention. "Your assessment of our systemic vulnerabilities is remarkably accurate," he continued after a moment, "particularly regarding our technology infrastructure and client service modernization. These are weaknesses I've recognized for years, but failed to address effectively." The admission, particularly from a man known for unwavering confidence in his own judgment, was unexpected. I remained silent, allowing him to continue. "Richard's leadership was becoming increasingly problematic," Jonathan acknowledged. "Not just the financial improprieties you've documented, but his strategic judgment and management approach." I was preparing to intervene before your acquisition changed the equation. Yet you supported his ascension to CEO, I observed, unable to resist highlighting this contradiction. He's my son, Jonathan replied simply, as if this explained everything. In many ways, it did. The powerful but ultimately destructive loyalty that had allowed Richard's worst tendencies to flourish unchecked within the family enterprise. Why are you telling me this now? I asked directly. Jonathan considered the question, his expression revealing the careful calculation behind this unexpected overture. Because Morgan Financial deserves leadership that prioritizes its long-term health over personal or familial considerations. Your actions, while personally devastating to my family, may ultimately benefit the institution I've spent my life building. There it was, the pragmatic recognition that transcended emotional reaction. Jonathan Morgan was above all else a businessman, capable of separating sentiment from strategy when circumstances demanded it. I'm not offering friendship or forgiveness, he clarified, perhaps sensing my skepticism. But I am offering something you'll need in the months ahead. My public support for your leadership transition, not enthusiasm, but explicit acknowledgement that this change, while painful for our family, represents necessary evolution for the company. The offer was significant, a counterweight to the resistance still forming among Richard loyalists and traditional stakeholders. Jonathan's endorsement, however qualified, would meaningfully alter the dynamics of our organizational transition. What do you want in return? I asked, knowing such support wouldn't come without conditions. 3 things, he replied without hesitation. First, protection of the Morgan name and legacy in your corporate rebranding. Modernize operations and strategy as needed, but maintain the foundational identity that 4 generations have built. A reasonable request, and one aligned with my own planning. Acceptable. Next. Second, a dignified exit for Richard. No criminal charges, no public humiliation beyond what has already occurred. Financial restitution for any improprieties, but handled through private arrangements rather than legal proceedings. This was more complicated. The embezzlement I had documented created potential liability not just for Richard, but for the company and board members who had failed in their oversight responsibilities. Yet, practical considerations made a negotiated resolution potentially preferable to protracted legal battles, contingent on full financial reconciliation and his permanent separation from company operations. I stipulate, Jonathan nodded agreement, and third, a role for James that recognises his capabilities without punishing him for family association. He isn't Richard. He deserves evaluation based on his own merits. Already addressed, I confirmed. James has demonstrated both competence and integrity throughout this transition. His continued leadership is valuable to our strategic direction, regardless of family connection. Something in Jonathan's expression shifted, perhaps surprise at my ready acceptance of his conditions, or recognition that I had already independently reached similar conclusions about these sensitive matters. Then we have an understanding, he said, rising from his chair. I'll release a statement tomorrow supporting your appointment and encouraging stakeholders to embrace this transition as necessary evolution rather than disruption. As he moved towards the door, Jonathan paused, turning back with an observation that bridged our professional negotiation and the complex personal dimensions beneath it. You would have made a formidable Morgan, he said, had circumstances evolved differently. I believe I already have, I replied, meeting his gaze directly. Just not in the way any of us anticipated. A hint of grudging respect flickered across his face before he departed, leaving me to consider the implications of this unexpected alliance. Jonathan's support, however pragmatically motivated, would significantly accelerate our transition timeline and potentially neutralize pockets of resistance that might otherwise have prolonged organizational uncertainty. More importantly, it represented tangible progress in shifting the narrative from reactive response to proactive reconstruction. Exactly the evolution Diane had identified as crucial for long-term success. With Jonathan's qualified endorsement complementing the operational improvements already underway, Morgan Financial could begin moving beyond the dramatic circumstances of leadership change toward a more substantive focus on strategic transformation. As I gathered my materials to finally depart for the evening, I reflected on how much had changed in just 1 week. The company Richard had expected to lead away from me was now being reshaped according to a vision that honored its foundations while embracing necessary evolution. The professional capabilities I had subordinated to supporting his advancement were now directed toward institutional renewal that extended far beyond personal vindication. Most significantly, the compartmentalization that had initially enabled effective crisis response was gradually giving way to integration, a recognition that personal resilience and professional leadership weren't separate challenges, but interconnected aspects of authentic transformation. The path ahead would still present formidable obstacles, but the foundation for navigating them was growing stronger with each strategic step forward. 3 days after the explosive family dinner, I sat in the sleek conference room of Adams and Blackwell, the law firm that had guided my acquisition of Hartman Industries. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, including the imposing Hartman building with its distinctive copper dome visible just 6 blocks away. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ms. Parker, I must say again how impressed I am with your strategic approach, Margaret Adams said, sliding another document across the polished table for my signature. At 68, Margaret was a legend in corporate law, the first woman to break into the mergers and acquisitions field in this city, and now the most feared negotiator in the state. Most people would have been paralyzed by the personal betrayal. You channeled that emotion into perhaps the most brilliant corporate maneuver I've seen in decades. I signed where indicated, my signature more confident than it had been on my marriage certificate 7 years ago. It wasn't just about revenge, Margaret. The best moves never are, she replied, her eyes sharp with appreciation. Pure emotion makes for sloppy strategy. This was surgical. She wasn't wrong. From the moment I discovered Jonathan's betrayal, finding those messages and hotel receipts, my first instinct had been emotional. The hurt had been physical, like something shattering inside my chest. But then, almost immediately, something else had emerged. Clarity. For 7 years, I'd suppressed my business instincts to play the role of supportive wife. My economics degree and MBA had been used only for the Hartman Foundation, never allowed to threaten Jonathan's position as the family's strategic genius. I'd watched from the periphery as he made increasingly risky decisions, expanding too quickly, leveraging the company beyond what was prudent. I'd tried to voice concerns, only to be dismissed with his typical condescension. Charity galas aren't quite the same as running a 100 million company, darling. The discovery of his affair had broken something open inside me, not just my heart, but the cage I'd allowed to be built around my capabilities. Jonathan still doesn't understand how I did it, I said, signing the final document. He keeps insisting I must have had help from a competitor. Margaret smiled thinly. Men like Jonathan can't fathom being outmaneuvered by someone they've underestimated, especially when that someone has been right beside them all along, taking notes. And I had taken notes, metaphorically and literally. Years of listening to Jonathan's boasts about business deals, his complaints about board members, his careless mentions of the company's financial structures. I'd been invisible in plain sight, absorbing everything while being dismissed as merely decorative. "The board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow?" I asked, though I knew the answer. I'd memorized every detail of the coming weeks. 9 a.m. sharp, Margaret confirmed. Richard Hartman insisted on chairing despite the circumstances, the old man's showing more backbone than his son. I wasn't surprised. Richard had built Hartman Industries from modest beginnings into a regional powerhouse. Jonathan had merely been born into privilege, never having to prove himself. The contrast between father and son had become increasingly apparent over the years of my marriage. "He called me this morning," I admitted, surprising myself by sharing this with Margaret. Her eyebrow raised. "Richard did? That's unexpected. He said he wanted to meet privately before the board convenes. And will you?" I considered this looking out at the Hartman building. "Yes. Despite everything, I respect Richard. He built something remarkable. It's not his fault his son couldn't live up to the legacy." Margaret gathered the signed documents, her movements precise. "Just remember, Olivia, sentimentality has no place in the boardroom. Whatever history exists between you and the Hartmans, tomorrow you are the majority shareholder making necessary changes to protect your investment." I nodded, but as I left the law offices, I found myself reflecting on the complex emotions beneath my calculated actions. The acquisition wasn't merely about revenge, though the look on Jonathan's face at the dinner had certainly provided a moment of vindication I would treasure forever. It was about reclaiming something that had been systematically diminished during my marriage, my own potential. The revelation wasn't that Jonathan had betrayed me. It was that I had betrayed myself by accepting his limitations as my own. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. Christopher Hartman, Jonathan's brother. I hesitated before answering. "Olivia?" His voice was strained but not hostile. "Do you have a moment to talk?" "I'm listening," I replied, stepping into the privacy of my car. "This situation," he began, then paused. "It's uncharted territory for all of us. Jonathan is..." Another pause. "Well, he's not handling things well." "I wouldn't expect him to." "No," Christopher sighed. "Look, I'm not calling about him, not really. I'm calling about the company, about the people who work there. There are 500 families depending on Hartman Industries. Before tomorrow's meeting, I just want to understand your intentions." The question was reasonable. Christopher had always been the more thoughtful of the Hartman siblings, less entitled than Jonathan, more aware of the responsibilities that came with privilege. "My intention is to save the company from your brother's mismanagement," I said simply. "The expansion into Asian markets is bleeding capital we don't have. The leverage position is unsustainable. I intend to right the ship, Christopher. So this isn't a slash-and-burn revenge takeover. Do you really think so little of me after 8 years?" His sigh carried through the phone. "No, that's why I'm calling you directly." Jonathan has been painting a rather dramatic picture. Jonathan sees himself as the victim in a narrative where he was the architect of destruction, I replied. "I'm not interested in destroying Hartman Industries. I'm interested in making it what it could be, what it should be, without your brother's ego driving decisions." After a moment of silence, Christopher spoke again. "For what it's worth, I think my father agrees with you. He won't say it publicly. Not yet. But he sees what's been happening." Another pause. "And Olivia, what Jonathan did? I want you to know that Sarah and I don't condone it. None of us do." The unexpected support caught me off guard, a small crack appearing in my carefully constructed emotional armor. "Thank you, Christopher. That means something to me." After we disconnected, I sat in my car watching the city move around me, people rushing between appointments, couriers delivering documents, life continuing its rhythm despite personal earthquakes. The revelation that had begun with discovering Jonathan's betrayal was still unfolding. Layers of understanding continuing to emerge. I had spent years believing that my role was to support Jonathan's vision. The revelation wasn't just that he had betrayed that support, but that his vision had never been worthy of it in the first place. The company I now controlled represented not just a business opportunity, but a chance to demonstrate what was possible when talent was unleashed rather than constrained. My phone buzzed again. A message from Elalana this time. Whatever happens tomorrow, remember you earned your place at that table long before you owned the chairs. The simple vote of confidence from my soon-to-be ex-mother-in-law brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Throughout my marriage, Eleanor had recognized something in me that her son had deliberately ignored. Her support now, when family loyalty might have dictated otherwise, spoke volumes about her character. As I drove toward my new apartment in the city, having left the Victorian home Jonathan and I had shared, I reflected on how revelations rarely arrive as single dramatic moments. They unfold gradually, each new understanding building upon the last, until you find yourself standing in an entirely different landscape than the one you thought you occupied. The revelation had begun with discovering Jonathan's betrayal, but it had expanded into something far more significant: the recognition that I had been complicit in my own diminishment. I had accepted his assessment of my capabilities, adjusted my ambitions to fit within the narrow confines he allocated, and surrendered my voice in decisions that affected my future. Never again. Tomorrow's board meeting would mark the public beginning of a new chapter, not just for Hartman Industries, but for me. The revelation that had started with pain was culminating in purpose, each step forward illuminated by clearer understanding of both the past I was leaving behind and the future I was creating. The most powerful revelation wasn't about Jonathan at all. It was about me, about the strength that had been there all along, waiting for the moment when I would finally give myself permission to use it. The Hartman Industries headquarters had always intimidated me. 52 stories of steel and glass crowned with that distinctive copper dome. It stood as a monument to 3 generations of Hartman ambition. I had visited countless times as Jonathan's wife, always slightly uncomfortable, aware of curious glances from employees wondering what the boss's quiet wife was really like. Today I entered differently, not through the public lobby, but via the private elevator reserved for the Hartman family and top executives. The security guard, momentarily startled by my appearance, quickly recovered his professional demeanor. "Good morning, Miss Parker," he said, swiping his card to activate the elevator. "Miss Parker Hartman," I corrected gently. "For now, at least." The elevator whispered upward, carrying me toward the executive floor and my scheduled meeting with Richard Hartman. I had deliberately arrived an hour before the board meeting, wanting this private conversation before the public confrontation. Richard was waiting in his office, the original corner office from which he had built the company before semi-retiring and passing the CEO position to Jonathan 5 years ago. At 73, he remained imposing, tall and broad-shouldered, with a full head of silver hair and piercing blue eyes that had lost none of their intensity. "Olivia," he stood as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming early. You said it was important." I took the offered seat across from his desk, noting the familiar surroundings. Unlike Jonathan's aggressively modern office, Richard had maintained a more traditional aesthetic: leather and wood, photographs of company milestones rather than personal accolades. Richard studied me for a long moment. "I've been thinking about the first time Jonathan brought you home. Do you remember what I asked you?" The memory surfaced immediately. "You asked what I thought about the Robinson acquisition Hartman was considering." He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "And you said?" "I said I thought it was overvalued by about 30%. and that the market position wasn't as strong as their annual report suggested. The answer had come easily to me then, fresh from my MBA program and still confident in my analytical abilities. Jonathan jumped in to change the subject, Richard recalled. Said you were being modest and didn't really follow business matters. His eyes held mine. I knew then. Knew what? That my son had found someone smarter than himself and wasn't comfortable with that fact. Richard's bluntness surprised me. The Robinson acquisition went forward, he continued. Cost us $17 million in write-downs the following year, exactly as you predicted. The validation coming years too late stirred complicated emotions. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Richard leaned back in his chair. Because I need you to understand that what you did, acquiring controlling interest in Hartman Industries, doesn't shock me. It disappoints me that it came to this, but it doesn't shock me. He folded his hands on the desk. I always saw your potential, Olivia. I just made the mistake of thinking Jonathan did too. I maintained my composure, though his words touched something raw. You never said anything. No. His acknowledgement held regret. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in my son's marriage. Traditional thinking. He shook his head. Perhaps outdated thinking. The admission cost him something. I could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the slight downturn of his mouth. Richard Hartman didn't apologize often and never admitted mistakes easily. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.